The squirrel was magic!
Cut off.
Beware your human heart. This is Diabolical Index for Monday, May 21st, 2018, where the pages of the Uncanny reside. I'm Corey Dawson, as always. Tonight we're in the Nut House, running a little bit late. There are all kinds of obstacles tonight that I won't go into, but we're here now. And just wanted to say hello and thanks everybody for tuning in, whoever's out there. It's been a little bit of, it's been a busy little bit of a time. All kinds of things have been popping up. There were movies wrapping up and starting, and inventories at workplaces, and weather, and disaster, and everything else you can possibly think of. So hopefully with any luck it'll be steady from now on. And it's going to be a good... I'll try to make it a good show tonight. I know it was definitely good works that I was getting into when I started thinking. Oh, speaking of good works, can everybody see this? Can you check this out?
Get the other camera real quick.
All right. You may have seen my my shameless plug with the T-shirt on the site the other day. Thanks again to Jennifer for making that for me and bringing it down to Paradox City Books and Games one day. Am I still over here? Or in the front now?
Yeah, you're still there.
Okay. Yeah, so thanks, Jennifer, if you're out there. Probably not. We're starting really late tonight, but all the same, this is pretty schwanky. And I wore it in the rain and no peel. It's going to be fantastic. I'm probably going to wear it until it falls off. Rest of my life. I'll end up in like a tank top or something. So... but I don't know. Do I have any plugs this time around? I guess, are there any Indiegogos or nothing? I think that all of that stuff is kind of wrapped up and things have begun and things are going into place. I know that the second half of the filming of Kill, Dolly Deadly 2 occurred in Winnemac over the last, I think it was last week. With the folks from HM&M Films and Heidi Moore came down, and it was really something. Toxic Avenger was there. It's a trauma film now, so definitely check that out. Kill, Dolly Deadly 2, HM&M Films, Heidi Moore. Go to H&M Films and Garage House. Check that out. And also, while you're at it, definitely, I've just thought of one. Definitely go to the State Theater, Winnemac, Indiana, for their Preservation Society. That's where the Midwest Horror Fest, Midwest Action Fest takes place. And can't do enough for those guys. So definitely get your pennies together and send it to the State Theater in Winnemac, because that place is just a total bastion of everything that's good and new and homemade. And it's wonderful. They have... burlesque shows there, and wrestling, and independent film, and local metal shows, and acts that are already established from all over the world. So definitely go to the State Theater Preservation Society and throw some money their way. A little bit of a tragedy though, dude. I mean, I'm not sure. I asked if it was the same guys, but there was a few photos of a big convoy, kind of like tow truck vehicle, like the flatbed tow, and one of the 1966 Batmobiles had I don't know if it had fallen off or something had hit it and it got crushed on one side. And I was just hoping it wasn't the same guys who were making it, because I believe that a lot of those reproductions are made out of fiberglass, and the fiberglass freaks in and around Winamac, Indiana, had a 1966 Batmobile I got to sit in during the Action Fest, and I hope that wasn't one of theirs. They were on their way to the West Coast, I believe. So I hope that didn't happen, but it happened to somebody's. Somebody's Batmobile was wrecked up real good, and it just made me cry. But let's go on to the births and deaths in May, and it's an illustrious group this time around. I can happily say that I'm familiar with every single name on this list, and some are true heroes and legends and just peaks in my mind. So the first one on the docket is the illustrious, infamous, incomparable Harlan Ellison. This guy has been around forever. He never goes bad. He gets he gets cranky. Well, not okay. I don't want to say cranky, but I would say his edge has never dulled over so many years. He ended up writing "City on the Edge of Forever," one of the most famous Star Trek episodes in the original 1960s Star Trek. He wrote for The Twilight Zone, The Outer Limits. He wrote a story called "The Demon with a Glass Hand" for Outer Limits, which is one of my very favorite episodes. It's about an immortal hero that just wakes up as an adult on Earth, and he's got a glass hand with two fingers, and as he kind of goes on the quest to find the fingers and find out who's taken over the Earth and why it's a wasteland, he ends up finding out a secret that would change the course of history. So definitely check that out. He wrote the screenplay for I, Robot that was never used. He wrote I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, one of the most famous science fiction stories of all time. Just basically, I mean, he's one of the most prolific science fiction writers that's ever come down the path. He's won every single award multiple times. I think he may have been on the World Fantasy Award board for a while and things. And he is a rabid critic. He wrote a column called Harlan Ellison's Watching for years that gave credit where credit was due, and definitely polished off some pretenders in his wake. So he does not put up with much. He doesn't suffer fools easily. He actually, one of the stories that became a movie that I'm shocked that it hasn't been remade yet. It's called Boy and His Dog. I can't recommend it enough. It's got a young Don Johnson in it, and it's about him and his faithful dog Blood traveling through the wasteland. And a lot of people nowadays, they kind of, it rankles just a bit because one of the major form of currency after the fall of man is woman, and that gets a little bit tricky. But definitely check out A Boy and His Dog. He went through great pains trying to make sure that it was made right, and so there you go, Harlan Ellison. Check him out in all of his works, critical, fiction, movie review, anything he does, anything he's got his name attached to, definitely check it out. And so the second one on my Born list is another one of my gigantic favorites, J.K. Chesterton. I believe his first name is Gilbert, if I remember correctly. He definitely looks like a Gilbert, but he wrote one of my favorite detective characters that has ever existed, Father Brown. He's wrote a few collections: Innocence of Father Brown, The Wisdom of Father Brown, and Father Brown is what I call an anti-detective. He specializes in being underestimated, whereas Sherlock Holmes is always at the peak of his powers, and everyone knows that he's this thinking, deductive machine, and he's almost like a diviner. He walks into a room and he can pick up a couple of hairs and look at a streak on the wall and tell you what happened, whereas Father Brown just kind of walks around almost like a droopy character, where he walks in and he says, "Oh, did something happen? Oh." And, there are cops walking around that are making all kinds of crazy determinations and and decisions and choices, and he just kind of walks around and kind of nonchalantly points out something or picks up something that catches their eye, and it turns out that he'd had a plan in his mind the whole time, and he had totally worked out the entire crime just in the few minutes that they were sitting there. So it's wonderful. Father Brown, anything Father Brown, definitely check it out. Don't get it mixed up with Father Dowling. There are a lot of priestly detectives out there, and no one beats Father Brown that I can think of, except for maybe Brother Cadfael, the Ellis Peters monastery mystery novels. Definitely check those out too, but that's not what we're talking about. And Mr. Gully has to come in and show me what's what. I've never heard of Norman Spinrad, so I have to check that out. For all, it's a pseudonym. Harlan Ellison had a few of those, and yeah, he's pointing out the voice of the dog. I didn't know that, and I think actually that James Cagney was almost the voice of Blood, and I guess that they went against that because they didn't want a recognizable voice as the dog. So yeah, definitely Norman Spinrad. Not sure. And actually, when it comes to Harlan Ellison, in some ways, for me, it's more of a curiosity than anything. There are some of his works that I find that are really compelling, and other ones, it's a difficult definition of how I think of them. I definitely think that they're flights of fancy, but every once in a great while, they're a little bit too self-important, maybe. I'm not sure. He was definitely, he is definitely a legend in his time and in his field, but every once, you're not going to like everything. In fact, and I keep harping on King over these, but Stephen King there was a big deal about him giving out a free short story the other day, and I guess it pertains to his new book, and I have to say I wasn't impressed. I wasn't even interested, really. It didn't seem like it was worthy of him. And maybe I just need to finish it. To be honest, I didn't even finish it. And in the past, I would have to say that Stephen King's short work, in my opinion, is some of his best work. But it's also going back in time. I would have to say that the earlier collections are definitely the better, and it's a shame to think that a lot of the stuff he did sober didn't pass muster for me, but who knows? Neither here nor there. But anyway, G.K. Chesterton, also a kind of a lay theologian. He wrote a lot of tracts and treatises on the Catholic religion and kind of like the state of it, the contradictions of it, the hypocritical notions of it. And I really like those as well. He wrote Orthodoxy and The Everlasting Man, The Man Who Was Thursday, the Club of Queer Trades. He's a wonderful writer in every respect, and I really wish I could wear a coat like he does too. But anyway, G.K. Chesterton, born in May, and the third on the birthing list is. Last but not least, I was just talking about Sherlock Holmes a moment ago. Arthur Conan Doyle, born in May, in the last couple of weeks as well. I can't remember what the date actually was, but it's one of those things where, I don't have to, it takes no introduction. Or Arthur Conan Doyle, if you don't know who he is, then shame on you. I don't know what else to say about that. But a lot of people think that Sherlock Holmes was his only character that he had created. And that's untrue. He actually created Professor Challenger, and to all the fans of Animonkai that are rambling around tonight at 11:05, definitely check out the Professor Challenger books, The Lost World, and the other titles are escaping me, but definitely check those out. It's an interesting read, and it kind of goes a little bit more into the fanciful, maybe more along the lines of a H.G. Wells or a Jules Verne rather than the Arthur Conan Doyle. And also, any fans of Flashman that exist, if you're out there, and I hope you are, because Flashman is by George MacDonald Fraser, easily one of the greatest scoundrels ever to play the game. If you've read Flashman, definitely check out Arthur Conan Doyle's character, Brigadier Gerard, I believe his name was, and it's kind of cut from the same cloth as Harry Flashman, Old Flashy. So definitely check that out. And there's also my interest. Harry Houdini and Arthur Conan Doyle were contemporaries and friends, and then later kind of, I guess, logical, philosophical rivals when it comes to the spiritualist movement. And Harry Houdini's destruction and debunking of most of the spiritualists that were operating during that time, and Arthur Conan Doyle's wife ended up having so-called medium powers and strength during that time, so they were kind of at odds at the end of their friendship. So Arthur Conan Doyle, very interesting guy. He was actually also involved with the fairy photographs. I can't remember where they were out of, but there were a couple of girls who had claimed to photograph fairies, and I think that him and Houdini had been involved in that hoax. It ended up being a hoax, but when they were involved in that, I think that they also kind of crossed swords during that. So Arthur Conan Doyle, born in May, and those are the births for May. And now it's time for the deaths in May, and they're no less prestigious in this list. We're still on, aren't we?
Yeah.
I thought we kicked us off. Okay, so
Hit play again.
let's see. Yeah, I'm missing out on my comments here. Oh my gosh, excellent. I grip your claw in greeting. That is wonderful. Norman Spinner. Oh, Doomsday Machine. Okay. Well, I'm looking at the what Mr. Gully is showing me here about what Norman Spinrad had done for the Star Trek series. Harlan Ellison wrote the unproduced script to Spinrad's Buck-Jack Barron. That's cool. That's interesting. There's nothing I love more than someone kind of turning me on to a name that I hadn't heard before. Buck-Jack Barron is a really interesting name. And they're novels too. Wow, I'm definitely checking that. Norman Spinrad. I'm writing that down. As soon as I write things. But let's see here. I think that the first death rather, that I had was let's see. I think it was Raymond Chandler. No, Max Beerbohm. Max Beerbohm. And I may be totally butchering the last name, but he was a fabulous caricaturist and parody writer around the time of Oscar Wilde, I think, and a lot of his stuff had been published in different magazines and things like that. And he was also on the radio for a time, and they called him the Incomparable Max. He had drawn people just out. I think he did something for Vanity Fair where he had drawn just kind of caricatures of the different types that you'd meet in bars and clubs and that type of thing. And I love that. I think it ended up in the Strand as well, and different, like Punch, different kind of I guess you call like satirical magazines at that time. And I think he actually, now that I think about it, I think he drew a pretty good caricature of J.K. Chesterton, now that I think about it. And Chesterton was this big, I don't know. I mean, I hesitate to call him a potato. I mean, he looked like he was just this larger than life, all coat, big faced. He kind of had the pince nez on, like, on his nose and stuff like that. But Beerbohm would draw these fantastic, famous people and just people from all walks of life. And it ended up making him a household name, and a someone that, you know, all sorts of celebrities would like to visit, just so that they would know that Max had given them their due on the paper. And so, yeah, I think he only wrote one novel. He had written a few short subjects on different things, and commentaries and little parodies here and there, satires, and then his only book, and it's a really, it's an interesting name, and I can't remember what it is, and it's not two words that you see together, so I can't remember. I think it was a name, like Zabrion Enoch Gill or something like that. It was a very, very strange name, and apparently at the New York Armory antiquarian book sale every year, people are always on the lookout for that book, and it fetches a hell of a price, and I guess it's difficult to find in good condition. But Max Beerbohm, definitely very, very interesting, died in May. And next is Raymond Chandler. I mentioned Raymond Chandler, the creator of Philip Marlowe, one of the most famous gumshoes in the history of noir and the kind of like San Francisco beat detectives, as made famous by Humphrey Bogart in the films, The Big Sleep, and I believe Farewell My Lovely and The Long Goodbye. That, strangely enough, Elliot Gould ended up playing a version of Philip Marlowe that was really interesting. And there are actually a lot of, just kind of like B-sides on a record, there are a lot of Marlowe books that kind of get short shrift in comparison with the other ones. Lady in the Lake and Little Sister. There are a few books that are out there that I don't see a whole lot in my travels. You always see the biggies, Big Sleep, Long Goodbye, and I don't know if it's due to the movies, and he ended up writing scripts and being involved in the making of a lot of those movies, and some of his favorite castings for Marlowe weren't the most popular in the public eye. Everybody wanted Bogart to do it, and I think he abided by Bogart, and he liked the popular response from him, but I don't think it was the Philip Marlowe he wanted. But I definitely recommend reading Raymond Chandler's letters as well. He had a real wry sense of humor and a biting wit, and he took it a lot seriously, and he didn't have any problem dressing you down when he needed to. And so Raymond Chandler, creator of Philip Marlowe, died in May. And last, not least, also died in May, Timothy Leary. I won't say the founder of the LSD movement, but definitely one of the larger proponents of it, along with Ram Dass in his time. The lysergic experiments and the tune in, turn off, tune out, something like that. I can't remember what the saying was now. I don't imbibe. I don't smoke up. I don't drop. I don't roll. But I'm not entirely unfamiliar. But hey, it was my birthday, college. What are you gonna do? But Timothy Leary was big into the expansion of the mind, and I think that a lot of his ideas had kind of helped a lot of people think about the medicinal uses, like not necessarily other than the recreational uses, but definitely the psychological benefits of the use of LSD that are kind of coming into vogue more with other mind-altering, expanding drugs that are mostly produced by the body that are coming into vogue now. But Timothy Leary, a giant in his time, he actually wrote a few books. One of them, strangely enough, I think it was called like The Deliciousness of One's Own Hand. It was a book about the wonders of masturbation, and I can't remember he had some great titles for his books, a lot of double entendres and puns, but I think that it was like Soul Survivor or Soul Candy or something. I don't remember, but Timothy Leary is a fantastic traveler and explorer of the mind. So Timothy Leary died in May. Not of this year or anything. I always get comments about that. They just died, but no, it was just the month that they have in common. So those are the births and the deaths of May for the Diabolical Index this time around. And all right, 11:16. What time we start? I'm trying to.
27 minutes.
27 minutes. All right.
Intro,
That's not too bad. I've been trying to.
I told you when it was 10, but.
Yeah, I was kind of picking up on that. I've been trying to pay a little bit more attention to how long I'm droning on with some of this stuff, because the other night we got to 2 hours and I just couldn't believe it. I could not believe my eyes that we had gone that far, and it honestly seemed like I was trying to actually grab for more time and try to put some more stuff out there, and it'd be 2 hours. Couldn't believe it. Wow, Mr. Gully's really on it. Los Angeles detective. Philip Marlowe. Whatever. Pick me apart. I'm tired. It's been one of those. It's been a harrowing day. It's been a hell of a day. So, anyway. The first novel on the docket tonight, I was talking in some of the posts about how these two books are kind of a exploration, maybe a little bit of a glimpse into the ideas of hell in everyday life, even in something as mundane as an apartment building, and also in the cubicle of the workplace. And the first one that I was going into was one of the most famous horror novels ever existed, and I have a sinking feeling that it's kind of fallen by the wayside due to a lot of the subtlety of the writing. And if you're not careful, I mean, Ira Levin is one of those writers where the fantastic and the impossible becomes commonplace. And sometimes I think that when people read this stuff, especially now in this time of constant explosion, noise, just the constant neural overload, I think that some of the subtlety, the subtler things out there kind of fall by the wayside sometimes. And it's a shame, because this is the first time I've read Rosemary's Baby. Ira Levin's one of his most in fact, it's difficult to say what Ira Levin's most famous works were, because it seems like almost everything he's written was famous. But Rosemary's Baby is a study in subtlety, and don't let that fool you, though. There are a lot of really explosive, almost damaging truths that happen in the book, but it gets, the curtain is over that because of it's just the normal everyday search for pleasant marriage, the introduction of children into the lives of a married couple, moving into a new place, having careers, dealing with neighbors, nosy neighbors and busybodies in your life, which everyone has to do. And in this case, they definitely take a toll on the couple. Rosemary and Guy Woodhouse are a couple who move into a very prestigious apartment building in New York, the Bramford, and one of Rosemary's friends, Edward Hutchins, a very, very classy English fellow. He ends up warning Rosemary and Guy against moving into what he calls the Black Bramford, due to its history of Victorian cannibal sisters and dead infants wrapped in newspaper found in the basement, and I believe that there were witches that were found there, and all these like rampant suicides that have happened in the building. And to Rosemary and Guy, they just, it's one of those things where you feel so lucky to have found something in the first the first instance somebody, that you first one you tell ends up tearing it apart and telling you why it's just, it would be hellish just to live there, just due to all the things that have happened in the past. And Rosemary isn't daunted, even though Hutch is one of her best friends. And they basically say, well, we're all sweetness and light. Nothing could possibly happen in this building as long as we're here. And as always in these types of books, that's the beginning of the end. But there's a gigantic cast of characters. It's difficult to make it work, especially in a book. I don't know how many pages it was, but it's kind of thin by comparison to a lot of the books that are out now, especially in that horrific genre of like supernatural romance. Those things tend to be door stoppers, and this, if I had to guess, I was somewhere in like the 300, 400 range. But somehow, in between those pages, there's a very, very horrific story that goes along. And I think that it's kind of, you get lulled into a false sense of security just by Rosemary's eagerness and her excitement, almost in every chapter, really, because when they first moved there, they have a lease on another place, and it's not quite as good. And for him, it would help his career to be in he's an actor. Guy Woodhouse is an actor, and unfortunately, she's not written as very much more than a housewife who looks through magazines to figure out what the best table is to have over here, antique over there, the color scheme, and everything has to be just so. They don't really go into a whole lot more than that, except for maybe her Catholic upbringing. But the first couple that they interact with in the building are the Castevets. It's Minnie and Roman Castevet, and they end up being more than they seem. Hutch is kind of like, I would consider Edward Hutchins to be the Van Helsing of the story. He's the one that tries to uncover and warn Guy and Rosemary about the dangers of living in the Branford. And it's one of those things where I kind of hesitate to spoil anything, but the story is so famous and has been around for so long that I don't feel too uncomfortable doing it. But basically, Rosemary Woodhouse is one of the most famous victims, and it, not to take anything away from her, but it's absolutely true. In every facet of her life, from the Catholic upbringing to kind of like riding the coattails of the husband's career, to the prestigious apartment building, dealing with these, at first they seem like they're kind of pests, the elderly neighbors, the Castevets, and her husband doesn't want to meet them and doesn't want to kind of have them intrude into their lives, because as we all know with neighbors, once you let them in, it's difficult to have them leave you alone. But once he finds out that they have ties to the movie industry, even, just a friend of a friend, knowing someone from a different circle and things like that, and then all of a sudden he starts to frequently visit the Castevets and even further alienates Rosemary and leaves her alone to the apartment that she's been making up, and just kind of casts her aside until he needs her. And it seems like he starts to need her almost as soon as the adopted, kind of like the taken in surrogate daughter of the Castevets ends up flinging herself from the window and crashing into a taxi and crushing her face on one side, committing suicide. And there are all these kind of whisperings of the girl having been on heroin and homeless, and then the two brought her in. And that kind of brings us to one part in Levin's writing that I I was fascinated with. And it's difficult to pull off. It can be kind of a clunky device to use if it takes a deft hand to get it to work right. But basically, one device that he used with Rosemary was, and it's, it goes along with the whole thing where it's almost as if she's blind in so many ways, and it's not a very strong female character. I can see why a lot of women's groups could be up in arms about the treatment of the character, because in one of the devices, she dreams, she falls asleep in dreams, and it makes me wonder. It's difficult to go into this completely ignorant of the Rosemary's Baby story, and it makes me wonder how I would have taken it then, but I could really appreciate the subtlety, because she would have a dream, and she would hear people speaking in the dream, and she would attribute it to nuns in the Catholic school and different priests that she had been around when she was a child, and Guy himself and friends that she had. And in her dream, her friends and old people that she had known were saying these things, but if you kind of take it out of context of the dream, you realize that what she is hearing in her dream is actually a conversation through the wall of the old folks, and complaining about how Terry, who was the girl who committed suicide, and their surrogate daughter, how she wasn't up to snuff for whatever this plan was that they were having. He gets sent a book from Hutch almost posthumously. He, on his deathbed, he tells his cohort in the hospital to make sure that she gets this book, and it ends up being kind of a history of the witchcraft influence of the Bramford. And it's funny because for being the character that Rosemary is, she's actually very, very astute in a lot of ways. She's very observant of the things that are going on. It's funny, she's really observant of everything that's going on around her except for the things that she really should be. She notices differences in the wall. She notices where pictures are gone. She notices where furniture has been moved, and that she loses a glove, and it gets mentioned to Hutch, and basically he starts putting two and two together, and he would have warned her more specifically about what was going on, but he gets taken out. But one of the things that she notices is that in the book that she sends him, or that he sends her, that Castevet, his name is an anagram for the name of this witch from a long time before, and that had been associated with the Bramford. So I don't want to give too much away, but basically the husband allows her to be involved in a ritual that she thinks is a dream. He ends up, not to put a too fine a point on it, but he kind of Cosby's her a little bit, and she starts to go down into a haze for the night, and he allows her to be taken. And during this, the dream device happens again, where she can hear conversations, and sometimes she actually does attribute people that she knows, and in this case it would be her neighbors and her husband, into the conversation. And it turns out that it's a lot more on point than she ever would have been aware of, because they're actually doing these things. And she dreams of symbols being drawn on her, and her husband taking her in this leather armor of a gladiator, but it turns out to be the leathery skin of another being altogether. So anyway, that should tell you enough about Rosemary's Baby. It is a total testament to Ira Levin's subtlety in writing, and just the grasp of the language, the grasp of everyday life, and just a total masterpiece, in my opinion. I thought that it was so calm, this calm horror where an apartment building could be the place of torture, and these neighbors could be emissaries of, you know, the lowest demonic presence, and something as simple of as a cabinet being out of place could mean uncovering one of the things that held her imprisoned by this horrific secret society that lived behind the doors and fashionable edifices of New York City during the 70s. So I totally recommend Rosemary's Baby. I doubt that a lot of people wouldn't recommend it. It's as much as I give Stephen King flack, he wrote, in my opinion, one of the best kind of like starter books for people looking for the best in horror and in some ways science fiction and fantasy of the years that stem before King's larger works, more famous works, in the form of movies and books, and even comic books in some ways. He wrote a book called Dance Macabre that came out in the 70s, and is basically a history of what turned him on in the movie genre, like horror movies and science fiction movies and books and things like that. And I totally recommend picking it up just to look through the I mean, there's a lot of great autobiographical things. Stephen King never hesitates to tell you about his life. So in that case, when that came out, it was kind of before his current role as almost like this weird Mark Twain or like man of letters of the 20th onto the 21st century. And I think it's a place that becomes kind of stagnant for him. But I'll definitely check it out. I'll be willing to bet that Rosemary's Baby is among the lists in the index. So there you go, Rosemary's Baby. So I had found a secondary book that went along with hell as described by the cubicles of your everyday job in this office setting, office space, in the circle of pandemonium type of thing. And I found a book by Hynes called Kings of Infinite Space, and it refers to the Shakespearean quote about putting him inside of a nutshell and he would be a king of infinite space. And I think that it's kind of like a little bit of a symbol of the walls closing in when you have reached heights of esteem, and you're forced to work in the confines of a carpet-lined cubicle, doing a greater job than what you're being paid for, which is pretty much as far as I can tell, it's like the siren song of practically everybody I know. I don't know anyone who's doing the job that they're capable of doing or have the aptitude to do, or the money level, that type of thing. So it makes perfect sense. But basically starts out with this guy named Paul Trilby, which I thought was totally interesting because, number one, when you think of the name Trilby, in my head anyway, I think of the Daphne du Maurier, bless you, Daphne du Maurier novel Trilby, that introduces the great hypnotist and the puppet master Svengali, and his treatment of Trilby, the girl off the street that he wants to make, almost kind of like an Eric from Eric Phantom of the Opera like plan for him to make her a star, and with her stardom line his pockets as well. But I think it's almost a symbolic gesture naming him Trilby, because in this case, Paul Trilby, and Paul meaning small, he ends up being at the mercy of kind of like wheels and machinations that are happening under the veneer of office life that were way beyond anything he could possibly see in his most horrible nightmares. But in this case, he works at a place called the Texas Department of General Services Department, which is almost like the Department of Redundancy Department. And to be honest, I read the whole thing, and it's difficult to know exactly what they were doing there, which I think may have been the whole point from jump. If you're working in a government run building that has to do with writing and rewriting technical essays on something that's going on in some kind of political sphere, I doubt that you could find anyone who could really tell you what they were doing from a day-to-day basis. But it opens with Paul in his car looking at, as most of us do if you're stuck in traffic or a red light, you're looking at the state of your car versus the state of other people's gigantic trucks and shiny new vehicles that they bought with most likely someone else's money. And he's sitting there waiting at the red light, just thinking about what went wrong, and in a lot of ways going over his life and what led to what hit the dominoes that caused the falling down of everything around him in his life as it was. And this strange egg-headed man starts walking up through kind of like the corridors and the distorted view of the heat coming off the cars idling, waiting for the traffic jam to let up. And at first he thinks it's a homeless guy, and as he gets closer and closer, he realizes that this guy isn't dressed too far away from his own style of dress. He looks as if he climbed out of an office building somewhere and just wandering aimlessly. And one of the main themes, I think, of Kings of Infinite Space is a quote from the Sayer of the Law from the Island of Dr. Moreau, the H.G. Wells book about Dr. Moreau making animals into men. And basically boils down to, are we not men? You know, we do not eat the bark of trees. We don't eat the fish or the beasts of the field. Are we not men? We are men. And this weird egg-headed man walks up to his window, and he keeps trying to avoid even looking at him because he doesn't want to interact with this strange person, and he's kind of self-absorbed thinking and self-pity. And he looks at he's got a "Hello, my name is" sticker on him, or a badge of some kind, and it says Boy G. And I thought that was really interesting. It almost sounds like a GEE, like G Willikers, you know, as if someone is getting into this kind of like zealous excitement and over-eagerness, and this guy is none of that. He's totally deadpan and I don't know, almost like monochromatic. The guy is just this flat piece of humanity that has just lost its way, and he just utters to him, "Are we not men?" And then the red light turns green, and of course, at a stoplight, when you haven't moved for a fraction of a second, someone hits their horn, and people blow around Paul, and he looks around, and he's all bewildered, and he realizes that somehow this large fragment of humanity has disappeared throughout all this stuff, and maybe he wasn't there to begin with, because as you go along with Trilby's story, you realize that Boy G is not the only entity that haunts him on a daily basis. And I was kind of pissed because I found out that one of the elements of this book had actually been established in a short story that was part of a collection that Hynes had written before. So there's a little bit of a history that I'm going to have to find out about. But basically, he maybe intentionally, I'm not sure because I haven't read the story yet, but no matter what, he's definitely paying for it. But the cat that lived with his ex-wife and himself in their apartment and stuck around after she had flown the coop ended up somehow drowning in his bathtub, and in the process never left his side or his life or his apartment. He notices that the microwave time has been not just brought down to noon as it would have, would have been with a power outage, but the time is actually changed, and doors are left open, and carpet is all snagged as if an animal had run into it and stopped abruptly, and he can smell the breath on his face, and he can see kind of like the remnants and ruins that Charlotte, which is the name of the cat, has left behind her, and he can't get away. So over time, different things start to enter his peripheral vision at work, and he starts to realize that there are things in play that he had never seen before and wouldn't have believed if he had. And the instances of Charlotte intervening in his life start to grow and grow as he realizes that there are 3 members of the staff that somehow, through kind of like the watchful eye of Olivia, the kind of like the major domo of Rick, the manager, Paul can't even leave his cubicle without her asking if he's done with his work when he arrives back, or mysterious post-it notes being left on his computer if he managed to stumble in the hallway, or make any sort of misstep towards Rick's office to ask for that raise that he's been looking for, seeing as how the man's got a PhD. He was an ex-professor, English professor, and now he's just typing copy and going through the lines of editing just to make sure Rick looks good. So he discovers that there is a secret society behind the cubicles at work, and it all stems from a man named Stanley, and his last name is almost incomprehensible. It's like Stanley Tunigi. It kind of reminds me of Sunigi, the serial killer from the Alex Cross novels. But the Colonel, JJ, and Bob Weir are 3 men that are they couldn't be more different. But they hang out together. Their cubicles abut one another, and they go to lunch all the time. And it's just one of those office cliques that you see in everything all the time, and they do exist. It's just one of those things where people start circling around each other, and they get hooked in. Except in this case, they get enamored with Paul after the raise that he ends up getting. He shows up finally in Rick's office after having gone through the obstacle course, which is his everyday at this office, making it from one cubicle to another without getting stopped by one of the sentries that seem to always want you to finish your job when they're not necessarily doing their own because they're paying attention to you. And in fact, Olivia, the major domo, is so, oh my God, she is so cold. The thing is that it's not as chilling as I would have thought it would have been, because I've absolutely known people like this. But there's a tech writer that has a cubicle almost directly across from Paul's cubicle, and the guy has a stoma. He's had throat cancer, and he has to cover up the stoma to smoke with. And it's horrible. But he basically says, I'm part of. I have an agent that sent me over here, and if when I'm done with the work, I get to leave. And she basically says, if I don't approve of your work, then the job isn't done, and you're not going anywhere. And she manages basically to burn him out to his death, which is the horrific wasteland and almost battleground of this office pool, which seems to get nullified whenever it goes anywhere near these 3 men. And it turns out that the spider-like Stanley that ends up visiting the office ends up being a big celebration of his tenure there as manager before Rick came along. And once Paul hears the story of Stanley, he wonders why there was such a celebration, because Stanley's management was steeped in tragedy. They ended up downsizing by 30 30 men that were under his employ end up getting the shaft along with him when Rick comes in, the young Turk. And the story goes that Stanley took 30 of them out to the state park to have this big party with brisket and a fire pit and ribs and music and all kinds of fun. And a flash thunderstorm happens, and everybody goes into the gigantic school bus that they had rented to go out there with, and a sinkhole opens, and the entire bus with everybody on it ends up going into the sinkhole and disappears forever, except for Stanley. He's found at the edge of the sinkhole, and he's the only one to survive. And that in and of itself lends a little bit of mystery to this man who hangs out with 3 lifers, and they seem to be just pleased as punch to be in the office when Paul could jump out the window at any time and be happier. And that kind of opens up the door to this seamy underbelly of the office, and not, it's definitely spiced up by the fact that this is not a honorable protagonist. It's a self-centered, petty, backbiting, full, just a bottle of regret somehow hung on to by a bunch of women that somehow found it okay to be his sexual objects, and anyone who had entered into any sort of long-standing committed relationship with him ends up feeling the brunt of his insecurities. And he leaves a path of affairs in his wake, and he ends up dating the girl from the male pool, and she feels am I over here now?
I was saying 1 hour about that.
Oh, okay. He's making all kinds of hand gestures I have to decipher them. But am I still over here then? Okay. But he ends up, I'm not so sure that he does it specifically towards her, but she feels the need to have a Norton encyclopedia of English literature that she goes through and has to almost bone up to, in her mind, relate to him in any kind of fashion, because that's another thing about this one. There's so many references to books throughout it, H.G. Wells and Shakespeare and all types of things that just, it makes you think, for me anyway, it makes me think of a kind of a mixture between kind of like the acrobatics of someone like a Palahniuk, Chuck Palahniuk, with kind of like the acrobatics of culture and language and different allusions to things that are going on now that have been, religious aspect, just everything, and the kitchen sink a lot of times with that. But at the same time, it kind of has this almost sad sack, everyday Americana vibe that has to do, for me anyway, with Thomas Berger, the author of Little Big Man and Regiment of Women. Totally recommend Thomas Berger in every way. Reinhardt is just below Flashman for me as a scoundrel character, but it's a lot more of a self-deprecating character. And if you mash those things together, it kind of reminds me of what this book is all about, especially since he's forced to go to, a lot of times in movies, like another thing I was reminded of was A Shock to the System, the Michael Caine movie, where he goes around killing the competition at his office building to get the spot that he wants and that he feels like he deserves to have. Except that instead of getting invited to the club or getting invited to a party in some prestigious high-rise, he gets invited to a karaoke party. And it turns out that not only is Stanley hiding in the wings at this party, he basically asks Paul for a sacrifice. And I'm not going to go any further than that, except to say that Paul does offer up someone willingly, and he finds out that the men who were left behind by the company didn't end up going down with the ship after all, and they're still around in subterranean ways to help out the other lifers at the company, as if they were doing their work to find meaning. But I don't want to say any more than that. I've almost given it all away right there. But basically, Kings of Infinite Space is it's a wonderful book. It's a wonderful study of kind of like the obstacles of American working life, and just kind of like the paranoia that we feel every day with the lingering regrets and doubts and things that we should have done that haunt us throughout our lives and creep around like an octopus on speed. I don't know. I don't know. Not a very good one. I don't know where they came from, but yeah, definitely. Kings of Infinite Space. I think it's Peter Hynes. Is that, or is it James Hynes? I can't read it. No, I'm looking at the screen with the cover on there. James Hynes with a Y. And he had a collection of short stories, and I think it's called like Perish and Publish, or Publish and Perish, something like that, that has the original story of Charlotte the Cat in it. So I'm going to have to check that out, because this book was a fantastic discovery. I'm not so sure that he hasn't done a series with this character in it. Sometimes when a series doesn't get quite as massively popular as another one, it doesn't get that, which I hate. I hate it, don't get me wrong, but sometimes it's difficult to tell where a series begins or where it ends, because it doesn't have that a such and such novel, which I just can't stand. But in this case, I was glad to have discovered James Hynes and the wonderful characters in this book. And it's strange, because a lot of times with the books that I do on here, it seems like there's only a handful of characters, but in both of these books, there's just like a galaxy of characters to deal with, and almost all of them are people that you've met in some kind of capacity before, and all the situations are just as horrific as anything that you would experience. So I recommend both of these books. They both have the subtlety required to lull you into a false sense of security, which I totally love. And I would say that on one hand, you have the waifish, I hate to call her a victim, but that's basically all. Rosemary Woodhouse is used by everything in her life that should have been a comfort, except for just a couple of friends that you get to meet. Everyone else has their own designs on Rosemary Woodhouse. And Paul Trilby, on the other hand, thinks that the world owes him a favor, and it turns out that the underworld does a favor for him. So I guess that makes sense in some sort of weird way. But anyway, there you go. Read both of those books immediately. They should be at your friendly neighborhood library or bookstore. City Books and Games. No, it's not there. I don't have either. Well, no, I have Rosemary's Baby, but I don't have Kings of Infinite Space. But I actually have a 3-book compilation of IR11 that's totally fantastic. It's got the Stepford Wives, this, I think it's called This Perfect Day, and Rosemary's Baby in it. So you can't get any better than that. I don't know if any of you have read the Stepford Wives, but if you haven't, you should. I doubt that there are any themes or situations in that a lot of people couldn't recognize in their lives. Now, they ended up making a really wonderful movie of it, and then they ended up making a really horrifically bad remake. So if you're looking for it on film, definitely look for the one that doesn't have Matthew Broderick in it. So anyway, there you go. All right. This has been the Diabolical Index for May 21st, 2018. It's been, I don't know what the hiatus was. I don't know how long I've been gone. But things come up. There have been a lot of things in the offing. And hopefully coming up soon, there will be a lot of new things that stem from the work that everybody's been doing behind the scenes of other things. I know that there are a lot of things half done and other things, kind of put together, and a lot of things, that have been started but not necessarily come to fruition. But it's probably because we were busy doing other stuff. So I plan on being around a lot more steady from now on. I actually have a few new Choose Your Own Adventure books that I didn't reveal in the last choice that I gave you guys that nobody really paid attention to. Hopefully you'll pay attention to it next time, because Harrison Ford might be on the front of one of them wearing a hat. All right, Sean. Hey, not that I don't. I mean, don't get me wrong. I love me some Matthew Broderick before 1990, something like that. He's awesome. But when you remake the Stepford Wives, you better mind your P's and Q's, because if you're not careful, you could just ruin any chances that you ever had of anyone watching the first one, which there's nothing that irritates me more than that. So if you're looking for good remakes, hopefully one of these days, Heckles and Horror and the Diabolical Index will talk about that in some kind of capacity. We need a little bit of, hopefully, I don't know, we're talking about a multi-genre review show and discussion analysis show coming up. Hopefully, everyone still is asking about previews. I don't know if that's ever going to take place, but that would be a hoot. I know we would have some lively discussion about that, but yeah. Yeah, actually, couldn't agree more, Sean. I watched War Games with my girlfriend not too long ago, and it hasn't lost one bit of its punch. And anyone who follows me elsewhere, I watched Cloak and Dagger last night, and it had been forever since I had seen that movie. And that it's not Matthew Broderick; it's Henry Thomas, the kid from E.T., and Dabney Coleman, the old bastard from 9 to 5. But definitely check that out. Actually, a friend of mine, Caden, came on and reminded me of a theory that I had read a while ago, that Cloak and Dagger is actually the prequel to Fight Club, for obvious reasons. If you would watch Cloak and Dagger, you could see exactly what I mean. And it's definitely a movie that could never be made now. Children are in definite mortal danger. They're put in situations where they have to act horrifically coldly. There's all kinds of just insanity in that movie, even for its time period, for the level of violence and for the special effects they have. Totally recommend Cloak and Dagger. I'm really surprised that they haven't remade it. Don't get confused with the Marvel Comics characters that are coming out on Freeform. It's not the same thing at all. Not the same thing at all. But yeah, definitely check that out. Anyhow, here I go again, talking about movies. But anyway, I'm going to wrap it up for now. And I will be putting up a list of maybe a couple of books to choose from for the Choose Your Own Adventure non-entry episode. That will hopefully be on Monday. I don't know, Memorial Day. That might be kind of risky. I'm not sure what's going to happen. But hopefully I'll be around. And as always, read books or else. Beware your human heart. Diabolical Index, where the pages of the uncanny reside. Coming to you from the Nut House. Hopefully soon we'll be back in Paradox City Books and Games. There's some technological things we have to work out down there. But until then, keep it squirrely.